2 U.S. Navy boats, 10 American sailors, 0 shots fired in defense. In under an hour, the most powerful navy on Earth didn't fight back. It knelt down, on camera, for the whole world to see. Iran didn't just capture sailors that day, they captured America's pride. And what happened next was even more humiliating than what Britain went through in 2007. Let's rewind for a second, because this isn't the first time Iran pulled off a move like this. Back in March 2007, in the same waters, Iran's Revolutionary Guard grabbed 15 British sailors and Royal Marines near the Shatt al-Arab waterway. Britain said their boats were in Iraqi waters. Iran said otherwise. For 13 days, the world watched British servicemen paraded on Iranian state TV, reading out scripted confessions, while London scrambled to negotiate their release. It was a diplomatic embarrassment Britain didn't forget for years. But what happened to the Americans 9 years later? That one didn't last 13 days. It lasted less than 24 hours. And somehow, that made it worse. Here's how it went down. January 12, 2016. 2 small U.S. Navy riverine command boats are moving through the Persian Gulf, cutting between Kuwait and Bahrain on what should have been a routine transit. 10 sailors on board, 9 men, 1 woman. No combat mission, no hostile intent. Just a training run that was supposed to end quietly, the way 1,000 other patrols had ended before it. Except this one didn't. Somewhere along the way, something goes wrong. A mechanical issue, a navigation error. The details are still murky, but the result isn't. The boats drift off course, and without anyone fully realizing it, they cross straight into Iranian territorial waters near Farsi Island, a tiny, heavily fortified outpost that just happens to be one of the most closely watched pieces of water in the entire Gulf. And Iran is watching. Within minutes, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps fast attack boats are closing in. These aren't slow-moving patrol vessels, they're fast, armed, aggressive, built for exactly this kind of moment. They surround the American boats before the sailors even have time to process what's happening. There's no firefight, no standoff, no warning shots exchanged. The Americans are boarded, disarmed, and taken. 10 United States Navy sailors marched off their own boats, on camera, by Iranian forces. And there's nothing the most advanced military in the world can do about it in that moment, because it's already over before anyone back home even knows it started. They're taken to Farsi Island, detained overnight. And while Washington scrambles behind closed doors to get them back, something else is happening that nobody in the Pentagon can control. Iran is filming everything. Because here's the thing about this kind of capture. It was never just about holding 10 sailors hostage for a few hours. It was about what comes after. It was about the cameras. It was about what the rest of the world would see once the footage got out. And when it did get out, it wasn't just a story about a navigation mistake anymore. It became a story about power, who has it and who just lost it, live in front of everyone. Within 24 hours, diplomatic channels move fast, and the sailors are released. On paper, it looks like a clean resolution, quick negotiation, quiet ending, case closed. Compare that to Britain's 13-day nightmare in 2007, and you'd think this was the better outcome. But that's exactly where this story stops being simple. Because what came next, the footage Iran chose to release, the way it was filmed, the specific detail that made American officials furious, and the political firestorm that followed back in Washington, that's the part that turned a 24-hour incident into something far more damaging than 13 days ever could be for Britain. And that's where we're headed next. The footage drops, and that's when everything changes. Iran doesn't just release the American sailors, they release a video first. A carefully produced, carefully edited video, timed for maximum impact, designed to be watched, shared, and replayed on every news channel from Tehran to Washington. This wasn't a leak. This wasn't a mistake. This was Iran choosing exactly what the world would see, and exactly how America would look while seeing it. And what the world saw wasn't just 10 sailors being released, it was something far more calculated. In the clip, one of the American sailors sits in front of an Iranian camera, hands folded, and says something no one back home expected to hear. An apology, not a hostage-style forced confession like the ones the British endured in 2007, but something quieter, something that felt almost worse because of how calm it was. He thanks Iran. He says the crossing into their waters was a mistake. He sounds compliant. He sounds defeated. And it's playing on loop everywhere, within hours. For a country that prides itself on projecting strength, this was the opposite of strength. This was a US Navy sailor on Iranian state media, essentially validating Iran's version of events, on camera, in real time, for the entire world to dissect. But that wasn't even the detail that lit the fuse. The real controversy came down to one image, the lone female sailor among the 10, standing there in a hijab. Iranian forces had made her cover her hair before the cameras rolled. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't incidental. It was a deliberate visual, a message wrapped inside a photograph, designed to say one thing louder than words ever could. We control this situation. We control this narrative, and we control how your people are presented to the world. Back in the United States, that image didn't just make headlines, it detonated online. People weren't just talking about a navigation error anymore. They were talking about humiliation, about control, about what it meant, symbolically, for an American servicewoman to be forced into a hijab by a foreign adversary and then paraded in front of cameras as proof of compliance. Commentators tore into it from every direction. Some called it a calculated insult, engineered specifically to embarrass Washington on the world stage. Others said it exposed something deeper, that despite all its firepower, all its warships, all its global reach, the United States had just been outmaneuvered by a handful of fast attack boats and a camera crew. And then came the politics. This wasn't happening in a vacuum. In January 2016, the Obama administration was in the most delicate phase of implementing the Iran nuclear deal, a landmark agreement that had taken years of painstaking negotiation to hold together. Critics were already circling, waiting for any sign of weakness they could point to. This incident handed them exactly that. Republican lawmakers didn't hold back. They called the administration's quiet, diplomatic handling of the capture a symbol of American weakness. Proof, they argued, that the White House was so desperate to protect the nuclear deal that it was willing to swallow a national humiliation without pushing back. Every soft statement from the State Department, every quiet handshake behind closed doors to get the sailors home fast, got reframed in the media as capitulation instead of diplomacy. Meanwhile, Iranian state media ran victory laps. Their sailors weren't just doing their job, they were the ones who made the most powerful navy on earth kneel on camera and say sorry. Compare that again to Britain in 2007. The British hostage crisis dragged on for 13 brutal days, and yes, British sailors were also paraded on Iranian TV reading scripted lines. But the world had time to process that story slowly, day by day, as a drawn-out diplomatic standoff. The American case was different. It was fast, it was clean on paper, and it was over within a day. But the image, the apology, the hijab, the political firestorm, back home, all of it hit in one devastating wave, all at once. And it hit harder precisely because nobody saw it coming. Britain's nightmare took 13 days to build. America's took less than 24 hours to detonate. And the fallout from it was only just getting started. Because what happened next, in the halls of Washington and in the eyes of the rest of the world watching, would raise a question far bigger than one bad day in the Persian Gulf. Was this really just a mistake? Or had America just been sent a message it couldn't afford to ignore? By the time the sun rose the next morning, this wasn't a Navy story anymore. It was a Washington story. The Pentagon tried to control the damage early. Defense officials stood in front of reporters and framed the whole thing as a routine resolution. A navigation mistake, handled quickly, sailors home safe, nobody hurt. Case closed, they said. Move on. Except nobody was moving on because the video was still playing. The apology was still looping. The image of an American servicewoman in a hijab standing in front of an Iranian flag was still being shared, screenshotted, and picked apart by every news outlet and every angry voice on television. And the more the Pentagon tried to downplay it, the more it looked like exactly what critics were already saying, a cover-up dressed as reassurance. Then, Secretary of State John Kerry stepped in. And it got worse. Kerry publicly thanked Iran. He credited Iranian officials for the professionalism of the release, framing it as proof that diplomatic channels, specifically the newly built relationship forged during the nuclear negotiations, were working. To supporters of the nuclear deal, this was exactly the point. Diplomacy diffused a crisis in hours instead of weeks. To critics, it sounded like something else entirely. It sounded like the United States thanking the country that had just humiliated its own sailors on camera. Senator after senator went on record. Some called it shameful. Others said no American administration in modern history had ever responded to a hostile seizure of its own military personnel with a thank you note. The word weak started showing up in headlines, in op-eds, in cable news chyrons over and over until it became the defining word of the entire episode. And then the comparisons started, because everyone on every side kept circling back to 2007. When Britain's sailors were seized, the British government didn't apologize. They didn't thank Iran. Tony Blair's government pushed back hard, publicly and diplomatically, insisting their vessel had been in Iraqi waters the entire time, refusing to validate Iran's narrative, even while negotiating behind the scenes for release. It took 13 days, and it was messy, and it was tense. But Britain never let the story become, "We made a mistake, and we're sorry." America's story, by contrast, wrapped up in under a day. But it wrapped up with an apology on tape and a thank you from the Secretary of State. And that contrast is exactly what turned a fast resolution into a slow-burning political wound. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that started circulating in defense circles. Speed isn't the same as strength. Getting your people home in 24 hours looks efficient on a press release. But if the price of that speed is a sailor apologizing on camera and a top diplomat publicly praising the very forces who seized him, then the fast resolution starts looking less like a win and more like a country that folded quickly because it had bigger priorities to protect, namely keeping the nuclear deal alive. International reactions split almost exactly the way you'd expect. Iranian state media treated it as a propaganda gift that kept giving, replaying the footage for days, framing it as proof that the Islamic Republic could bring the American military to heel without firing a single shot. Regional allies and adversaries alike took notice, because in a part of the world where perception often matters as much as firepower, Iran had just demonstrated on camera for free that it could intercept US forces on short notice and dictate the terms of their release. European allies were quieter, but the unease was there too. If this is how quickly and cleanly American vessels could be captured and made to apologize, what did that say about deterrence in the wider Gulf? Britain, still carrying its own scar tissue from 2007, watched the American episode with a strange kind of grim familiarity, like watching an ally walk into the exact same trap, just faster. Inside the US military, the incident triggered its own reckoning. Investigations opened into what exactly caused the navigational failure, why standard procedures didn't prevent the boats from drifting into hostile waters, and why the crews surrendered without resistance. Officially, the Navy stood by its sailors, saying they followed appropriate protocols under the circumstances. Unofficially, questions lingered for months about training, readiness, and how a routine transit turned into a global embarrassment in under an hour. By the time the news cycle moved on to the next crisis, one thing had become impossible to ignore. This wasn't just an incident anymore. It was a case study, one that historians, military strategists, and political rivals would keep coming back to for years. And that's exactly where the story goes next, because the final chapter isn't just about what happened in the Gulf. It's about what it changed, permanently, in how the world saw American power on the water. So what actually changed after all of this? Because an incident like this doesn't just end when the cameras stop rolling, it leaves something behind. And what it left behind was bigger than 10 sailors and 2 boats. Start with the military side, because that's where the real, lasting damage happened. In the months that followed, the US Navy quietly overhauled procedures for small boat operations in contested waters. New protocols were introduced around navigation checks, communication with regional commands, and what crews are supposed to do the moment they suspect they've drifted into hostile territory. Behind closed doors, this was treated as a serious operational failure, not because sailors did anything wrong in the moment, but because the system that was supposed to prevent this in the first place had clearly broken down somewhere. And that's the part that should worry people more than the video ever did, because a single navigation mistake shouldn't be enough to hand a geopolitical rival a propaganda victory this clean. But it was, and Iran knew exactly what to do with it. That's really the deeper story here, not just what happened to those 10 sailors, but what it revealed about how modern confrontations actually get won and lost. Nobody fired a weapon in the Persian Gulf that day. There was no battle, no casualties, no dramatic rescue. And yet, by almost every measure that matters in the modern information age, Iran walked away with a clear win, because they understood something that a lot of militaries still underestimate. The camera is the weapon now. Think about it. Iran didn't need missiles or warships to embarrass the most powerful military on Earth. They needed 10 minutes of footage, a hijab, and a scripted apology. That's it. That's the entire arsenal it took to dominate global headlines for a week straight, trigger a Senate uproar, and force a Secretary of State into a defensive press conference. No war, no shots fired, just a camera pointed at the right moment, at the right people. And that's exactly why this incident still gets brought up years later, in defense briefings, in journalism classes, in political debates, because it became the go-to example of how perception can outweigh firepower. Now put it next to Britain's 2007 ordeal, because the comparison is what makes this whole story land. Britain's nightmare dragged on for 13 days. It was slow, grinding, and painful, but Britain never gave Iran the one thing it wanted most: an admission of guilt. London held its line the entire time, insisting their sailors were in the right, even while quietly negotiating for their release behind the scenes. It was a long, ugly ordeal, but Britain's government never let the story become, "We were wrong and we're sorry." America's ordeal was the opposite in almost every way. It was fast, resolved in under a day, but it came at the cost of exactly what Britain refused to give: an apology on camera, a hijab worn under compulsion, photographed and circulated, and a Secretary of State thanking the very forces who orchestrated the whole spectacle. Speed without dignity isn't really a win. And that's the uncomfortable conclusion so many analysts came to once the dust settled. Britain lost time, but kept its posture. America saved time, but lost the narrative completely. That's the real answer to the question this story keeps circling back to: was this bigger than the Royal Marines incident? In raw duration, no. 13 days is longer than 24 hours by any measure. But duration was never really the point. What mattered was what each country was forced to give up to get their people home. And by that measure, the American case cut deeper. It wasn't measured in days. It was measured in what the entire world watched happen to the reputation of the most powerful navy on the planet, compressed into a single viral video that outlived the incident itself by years. Because incidents like the 2007 Royal Marines capture faded into history books, but the 2016 sailor video, that one still circulates. It still gets pulled up in arguments about military readiness, about diplomatic weakness, about what it really means to project power in the 21st century. And maybe that is the real nightmare in all of this. Not that it happened, but that it never really stopped happening. Every time someone brings up American deterrence in the Gulf, every time a debate breaks out about strength versus diplomacy, that footage resurfaces. 10 sailors, one apology, one hijab, one thank you. One moment that Iran turned into a permanent scar, and one that America still hasn't fully lived down.